A few years ago, economists Anne Case and Angus Deaton coined the term deaths of despair to refer to an unprecedented increase in suicide, drug overdose, and alcohol-related liver disease among working-class white Americans over the course of the 21st century.
That starting in 1999, the death rate of middle-aged white Americans has been going up instead of down.
And we thought we must have made an error. I mean, the whole world is getting better. This middle-aged group is the one that's benefited most, at least since 1970, from advances in the treatment of heart disease, from people quitting smoking, all of those things. And then suddenly for this trend that's going down just to reverse out, seemed like it had to be wrong, but it was not wrong.
The big increase was in what Case calls deaths of despair, alcohol-related liver disease, suicide, drug overdose.
People kill themselves slowly with alcohol or drugs, or quickly with a gun. For people aged 50 to 55, for example, those rates went from 40 per 100,000 to 80 per 100,000 since the turn of the century. And it's people with a high school degree or less who are killing themselves in these ways in large numbers. That's the group that's getting hammered.
So Case and Deaton found that in 2018, there were around 158,000 deaths of despair in the US, or the equivalent of 3 fully loaded Boeing 737 jets falling out of the sky every day for a year. Now, to add to this, Case and Deaton recently published a new paper that looks at all-cause mortality, so not just deaths of despair, but basically deaths from everything, and found that, again, people without a college degree are dying much faster than those with a college degree. Their new study found that this wasn't just the case for whites, it was the case for all races. So on this graph, the solid lines represent mortality rates for people without a college degree, and the dotted lines represent people with a college degree. So the green lines represent Blacks and the blue lines represent whites. And basically what we can see here is that particularly after 2010, there's been a huge discrepancy in mortality between people with a college degree and those without for both whites and Blacks. As Case and Deaton write, as educational gaps have widened, racial gaps have narrowed so that Blacks with a BA are now closer to whites with a BA than they are to Blacks without a BA. That's basically the opposite of the situation in 1992 and up to around 2000. In other words, people of all races without college degrees are clearly getting screwed over. So why is mortality for people without a BA climbing in the US when this is not the case in other rich countries? According to an author named Jonathan Metzl, it's because white Americans are so committed to whiteness that they keep voting against what he calls their biological self-interest. In 2019, Metzl published a book called Dying of Whiteness: How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. The book was an instant hit with the liberal media. It was covered by NBC, PBS, MSNBC, Brian Lehrer, NPR, The Washington Post, and it even appeared on an anti-racist reading list assembled by none other than Ibram X. Kendi for the New York Times. Here's Metzl talking about his book on Bill Maher.
So you wrote a very interesting book. We've heard before that the Trump voter votes against his own economic interests, but you're taking it quite a bit further, and you're saying that Trump policies actually make it more likely that the mostly white male voter, who is the Trump core voter, is going to get sick and die.
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, that is kind of what I'm showing.
We're not allowed to call them stupid.
I'm a professor and I'm a doctor, right? And I
Me too.
Okay, welcome. I know,
as far as you know.
Dime a dozen these days,
Yeah.
right? And so, you know, basically the core argument of the book is that the politics that claim to make white America great again end up making particularly working class white lives harder, sicker, and in many instances shorter. I spent about 7 years going through the South where I live and tracking the story of basically what happens if you live in a state that, for example, blocks healthcare reform, that lets anybody and everyone buy a gun.
Medicaid expansion.
Medicaid expansion, blocking the expansion.
Save many lives, and
huge tax cuts that end up undercutting roads, bridges, and schools. And what I found was, on one hand, that gave many people the sensation of winning, but when I looked at it from a medical angle and from a data angle, those policies themselves ended up being as dangerous to people, and particularly working class white people, as asbestos or secondhand smoke or not wearing seatbelts in cars. They were literally contributing to a shortened lifespan.
And what's even worse is that, according to Betzel, these people just can't be budged. Here's what he told PBS about the depths of working class white people's commitment to the politics of racial resentment.
This book is an object lesson in a lesson that I think that liberals were very slow to respond to, which was the depth of commitment that many working class white Americans had to particular positions, even if those positions were bad to them. People were quite literally willing to lay down on the tracks, put their own lives. I mean, in Kansas, people were willing to support tax cuts that affected their own kids' schools. And I think liberals really missed that. They missed the depth of that particular kind of commitment. And certainly for people who care about particular social issues like the courts and abortion and factors like that, that felt like a fair trade-off for them. And again, I think that's an important point. This is a book about the depth of that commitment to those positions.
So if the problem is all these working class whites who are blindly committed to preserving the racial hierarchy at their own expense, what should we do about it? In an interview with Vox, Metzel said this: ultimately, working class white communities are going to have to demand more or better from their politicians. They're going to have to stop falling for the racist scapegoating and instead demand better healthcare and roads and schools. Can you imagine what would happen to the GOP agenda if working class white communities in the South said, yeah, we support the GOP, but we also want Medicaid expansion and we want better schools and bridges and we want the government to stop giving tax breaks to rich people? Well, we don't have to imagine. Let's look at what happened when a GOP stronghold in the West did exactly that. I'm talking here about Idaho, which some of you may know is my home state. In 2018, a year before Metzel's book came out, Idaho residents, who are overwhelmingly Republican and 90% white, voted on a ballot measure to expand Medicaid in the state. The Medicaid expansion measure passed with the support of 61% of voters, or a clear majority. So what happened here? Did the white people of Idaho mysteriously all receive copies of White Fragility and Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack and suddenly come to realize how backwards their attitudes on race were? Did they undergo some kind of collective racial reckoning to overcome their steadfast commitment to whiteness? Actually, what happened was much simpler. A nonpartisan group of volunteers and organizers in Idaho decided to go door to door and talk to voters. Take a look.
The Medicaid Express bus stopped in Coeur d'Alene today. The group Reclaim Idaho is touring with the goal of expanding Medicaid statewide. They want to expand Medicaid to cover 62,000 Idahoans who aren't covered by health insurance. And the group claims expanding Medicaid will actually save taxpayers. New on Nightside, Kyle Simchuk walked with volunteers during a doorbell ringing campaign tonight. And Kyle, many homes you visited in Coeur d'Alene seem to support the idea.
Well, Aaron, and they seem to understand what's at stake here. That is the mission of this statewide tour, to inform voters. When Reclaim Idaho launched their effort earlier this year, skeptics said their biggest hurdle would be getting signatures in the dead of winter.
I have 6 little warmers on my body in different places to stay warm.
Their persistence paid off. Prop 2 is now on the November ballot. Now Reclaim Idaho is at it again, making sure voters check yes.
My name's Luke. I'm a volunteer out talking with people about the big Medicaid expansion vote coming up.
Luke Mayville is the co-founder of Reclaim Idaho. For the next 18 days, he and several volunteers are traveling around the state in this green bus, chatting with voters.
By voting yes, they can extend health care to 62,000 Idahoans who desperately need it.
Those 62,000 Idahoans are living in limbo, making too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but not enough to afford health insurance on the state exchange. Proposition 2 would expand Medicaid to include everyone under 65 whose adjusted gross income is 133% of the federal poverty level. That works out to be about $16,000 for a single person or about $33,000 for a family of 4.
There's still a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of people think that this is going to be a real tax burden for Idaho, when it's really the opposite.
Federal dollars would cover 90% of the expansion costs, and Mayville says it would scale down emergency county and state programs that cover medical bills when patients can't.
If we do our work of going out and finding our supporters, getting our message across, we will win.
As it turns out, this strategy worked. And though, of course, I have a soft spot for Idaho, I'm actually not just cherry-picking one heartwarming tale of triumph in an otherwise doomed nation of racist, Medicaid-hating Trump voters. Since 2016, voters in several other heavily Republican, majority white states, such as Utah and Nebraska, have also approved ballot measures to expand Medicaid. According to Politico, these ballot measures together made up the most significant growth of Medicaid expansion since the early phase of the Affordable Care Act, and a resounding rebuke to GOP lawmakers in states that have rejected a program that's financed mostly with federal dollars. It also came as the Trump administration tried to shrink Medicaid and Republican lawmakers in Washington took another crack at Obamacare repeal. So, when white people in red states got on board with Medicaid, did Republican state legislatures suddenly collapse because the people had risen up to demand more? No. The Republicans did what they do best, that is, ignore a popular mandate in order to push austerity politics, and immediately tried to block or attach punishing work requirements to the Medicaid expansions that the people had just voted to pass. Now, thankfully, the Medicaid expansions in the 3 states I mentioned are currently still in place, but they're constantly subject to attack from GOP lawmakers. So this is all to say, are there racists who would rather literally die than vote for policies that even seem like they might help non-white people? Of course there are. Does this group of people exert more power on our political system than the Republican Party elite, business lobbies, the Koch brothers, and other big money interests that oppose expanding Medicaid? I doubt it. When it comes to thinking about why people vote against their self-interests, as the saying goes, I'll let Professor Noam Chomsky have the last word. He spoke with our friends on the Weekends show last year and said this.
Is it possible for the working class to work together regardless of their overall political ideology, whether they're on the right or the left?
Well, first of all, they have to have something to vote for. If the Democrats say, we don't care about you, now, we're the party of Wall Street and rich professionals. We have Hollywood stars at our events, and who cares about you? Yeah, they'll vote for the guy who's, I like you. I act like you. I hate the elites. Well, vote for that guy, even if he's not doing anything for them, and in fact, screwing them.
If we're going to have any success even approaching what our socialist and labor-oriented predecessors once accomplished in this country and around the world, we should begin not by throwing up our hands at the irredeemable whiteness of red state America, but instead by A, recognizing that most people are basically rational, and B, it's therefore the job of political organizers to build a culture of working class solidarity, despite and sometimes against various other kinds of identities. As Professor Chomsky put it, unless there's a constructive alternative, people aren't going to join a movement.
You were right about that Bill Maher clip.
I warned Ariella about it beforehand. She didn't get a chance to see it, and I was like, buckle up.
Yeah, I don't make a habit of watching him, but he has this, what is obviously elitist disdain for people who are dying. That's the subject that he's talking about. He's like, we can't call these people stupid. I also think there's the kind of standard American racecraft bait and switch here. It is really a problem to say this group of white people are voting against their self-interest. They'd rather die, right, than expand programs that might help other groups. It's a problem because it allows liberals to feel okay with saying things like, well, then just let them secede from America and die.
Right.
It creates this bracketing off of people with similar interests, and it makes an issue like your right to life into a partisan issue, which it's not. And I think that, this is a case study in that.
Yeah, like I was saying, Ariella and we both grew up in predominantly white red states. And so, I definitely know people who literally are probably so racist that they're never going to vote for anything that could possibly help a non-white person. Like, that's a person that exists. But I think part of the point that I wanted to make is I don't think that this person's influence on the Republican Party is as great as, say, the Koch brothers. Do you know what I mean? And I think that,
Absolutely.
again, to connect it to a point that Paul Heidemann made when we interviewed him and also in his article, like, the Republicans' base is actually not the working class white people that Bill Maher and even Jonathan Metzl and some of these liberal commentators want to blame. There's two things going on here. One, are there racists? Yes, of course, naturally, like we already know this. B, do they actually wield that much power? Debatable.
Yeah. Yep. And what they're doing is they're kind of creating a straw man with a caricature of white poor workers, right?
Yeah.
And saying these are the people to blame. These are the people we have to wag our fingers at. And you saw this after the riots in January when they were saying some of these people took a private jet here, as though their imagination that all of these people were, like so-called trailer trash, to use a term that makes me really uncomfortable.
Right.
How could they have actually afforded this? There's a deep-seated logic that those who are wealthy have earned it through being rational, through being good workers, through being the right kind of patriots, through, succeeding in the meritocracy. And that all of those, dumb idiots who are poor are to blame. And we can unpack that and see that in these, white racist voting patterns. And that has to be crushed. That ideology is so toxic. It has to be crushed. It is terrible. It is terrible. It's essentially what allows people to think that condemning these people to die is just, part of the natural order of American meritocracy. That if you have people who are, living in intractable poverty and who aren't voting for,
the way you want them to vote.
Yeah, exactly. To meet your expectations, then those people don't count. And it really is deeply, deeply insidious and something that's trotted out by liberals over and over and over again, and only fuels the divide, only fuels the resentment, and lays the groundwork for someone to come in and be like, they think you're garbage. I mean, we saw this with the deplorables, basket of deplorables comments.
Bill Maher literally laughed at people dying.
Yeah.
He's making it easy.
Yeah. And said, oh, and we can't call them stupid.
Right.
I mean, the other thing is, it takes a lot to build grassroots power. Most voters are disenfranchised in America. And it takes a lot to actually rebuild something on the scale that could face up to business lobbies, PACs, well-established, Republicans, local elites.
Yeah.
It's a big, big fight. It's not just that these people are going like, I'm going to throw my hands up because I don't want, one or two Mexican people to get Medicaid.
Right.
And you're right. There are those people who are so resentful that they're like, I'm going to do something, to stick it to the imaginary other or whatever. But they're not really a big part of the game here.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.